Hi everyone, welcome to The Craft, a series where Openspace talks to those with a storied experience around different leadership themes. Today we're super excited to be joined by Tom Wright, an investigative journalist and speaker on financial fraud and politics. Tom is also the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Billion Dollar Whale. Tom, welcome.
Hi, and the Fat Leonard podcast. I've got to promote that.
So the keyword today for this episode is investigation. So we clearly have an expert here. But before we start, Tom, I wanted you to share with the audience of how did you get into doing what you're doing?
Well, I worked for the Wall Street Journal for 20 years. I joined them in the late 90s in Asia, and I worked in a number of different jobs for them around the world. And that's how I built up my skills in journalism. It's a great place to work. A very thorough organization. You really learn the nuts and bolts of doing investigations and very strict about what you're allowed to say and the kind of sourcing you need. And so I got a really good basic training over the years doing that. And, you start off doing simple stories and covering events and doing corporate work, covering companies, that kind of thing. And then eventually I ended up doing a bit more of investigative work later on, and that led to covering the 1MDB story about 7 years ago now.
So I think with the recent developments of, Najib going to jail, Rosma being convicted, the story of 1MDB got brought back to light, and I'm sure you're quite excited, I guess, to finally see the justice being brought to the Malaysian people.
I try not to care too much about outcomes doing journalism, and it's more about a couple of things. One is just doing your job and reporting on what's going on. And the other one is finding stories that are basically sexy, that are going to attract a lot of viewers and audience, podcast listeners, readers of books. So those are my motivations. I think when journalists or writers in general start to think about the ends, then that's very dangerous. We are currently... Bradley and I, the co-author of Billion Dollar Whale, we're running a campaign to find Jolo because, as you said, Najib's gone to jail. Roswell's been found guilty and she's appealing, his wife. But Jolo's still on the loose. So we're trying to find him. We're trying to get evidence of where he is. But that doesn't mean we want anything particular to happen to him, right? Like if the justice system of Malaysia or the US, where he's been indicted, decides that, if he ever turns up in court and is jailed, well, then that's what the system does. That's not really our job to do that. But it's definitely our job to shine as bright a light on things as possible, and that's why we're sort of trying to find Jolo at the moment and find out where he is. But we're not going to do a citizen's arrest or anything like that. That's not our job, right? And you've got to be very careful about what journalists do and what they don't do.
Right. So does that mean there's possibly going to be Billion Dollar Whale 2?
Yeah, Bradley and I are talking about maybe doing Hunting the Whale, as a sequel.
Wow.
It depends what the audience for it would be. I think it might be quite high, actually. I mean, if you look at the epilogue of the latest edition of Billion Dollar Whale, there's lots happened. I mean, if you type in Pras Michel of the Fugees and Jolo into Google, you can go read about that, how Pras allegedly played a role in trying to get Jolo out of trouble and will likely go to jail in that case, and the role of China. And I mean, it's very complicated. So there's a lot just shoved into the epilogue that could be the basis of a sequel. So we're discussing that, and we may do that.
Sounds interesting. So I read the book. I think it's an incredible story with a lot of details in behind the scene, right? So I was just wondering, how did you start, coming across the story? How did you start planning for writing the book and approach the people that you want to speak to, convince them to give you the details and facts you would like to include, and also fact-checking and verify the details? How was that process, and how did you, get to do it?
Well, like most things in life, journalism is some serendipity and some hard work. You prepare hard for something and then you get lucky. And that's what happened to us with Billion Dollar Whale. I mean, I was lucky enough to have a front page story in the Journal about how Najib was using the 1MDB fund as a slush fund. And that came out in July 2015, just as some people in the Malaysian government were looking to leak Najib's bank accounts, about the 681 million that he took into his personal bank accounts. So we got hold of those documents, and we had a second source. So there was a whole part of the Malaysian government that knew what was going on and wanted to I don't know. I mean, partly they wanted to cover ass, right? But also they wanted to get out. And so, for us, we're often criticized. In Malaysia, people say, well, you're just taking Mahathir's side, who obviously replaced Najib. But that doesn't matter. For us, if something's true, then it's true. It doesn't really matter where you get it from, right? You don't want to play politics, but you want to make sure that, and we saw this with the Hunter Biden laptop, in my view. People came out and said that was false because they didn't want Trump to win re-election. Whatever you think about Trump, turns out that laptop is real, right? And so you really need to look at information like as independently of where it's coming from as possible. So the reason we were able to report about Najib's accounts was we got two sources. We didn't just have the account documents. We had a human source as well, very, very senior Malaysian government official at the time. Yeah, and then so that was the beginning of the process. That was 7 years ago. And Bradley is a very, very good investigative reporter. He'd lived in the Middle East. So one of the keys to the reporting $1 billion whale was getting hold of a lot of email servers. So we got hold of the email servers of Red Granite Pictures, the film company that they set up with the stolen money that made The Wolf of Wall Street. We got hold of emails of like the UAE ambassador to Washington, who was a big help. He really helped grease the wheels for Jolo. So all that we got so many different contact numbers from those email servers, and we were able to sort of use that and spread out. Bradley got hold of all kinds of documents from the Middle East. We got hold of Jolo's BlackBerry messages in Excel spreadsheets. So it became a very laborious work to go through. It's not something you can really farm out to junior researchers. We had to do it all ourselves. To go through it at great length and find the nuggets of gold in the documents that we needed for the book.
Yeah, so I was also wondering, when you were going through the process, it must be super lengthy and detailed and a lot of things to comb through, right? But was that something that was a little bit more public? People knew you were investigating into it, and then a lot of people actually seek you out and say, hey, I've got something that you might find interesting, or it had to be kept secret? Or were you at any point worried that somebody else is also investigating into the same method, so they might, publish the story before you guys do?
Well, we didn't break the OneMDB story. It was broken by a Malaysian newspaper called The Edge,
right, The Edge.
and the Sarawak Report, right? So they actually broke the first stories about Jolo and this Seychelles company. This was a few months before our entry into the story. It got to the point, journalism is a little bit like that. You have to make sure that you're ahead of the competition. But what happened with OneMDB was we were so far ahead. We had so many documents at one point, in 2015, that it became very difficult for all our competitors to sort of catch up. And they tried to do stories, but they just didn't have the knowledge. And it was very complicated. Even, we at one point, we thought that Najib was the center of the fraud and Jolo was sort of like a facilitator. But then as we did more reporting, we worked out, well, Najib was definitely guilty of using this money for a slush fund for the political reasons and for his wife to buy $26 million pink diamonds and all this kind of stuff. But he didn't know exactly what Jolo was doing, and we worked out Jolo was the center of it. So we got to the point where it's almost like a snowball. It's very hard to get the snowball to catch snow, but once it's rolling, then people start to come to you and it gets a lot easier. And it got to the point where it was difficult to tell the story because it was so complicated and there were so many details. But it was easier in terms of sourcing. People were more willing to talk to us rather than anyone else because we were the only ones who knew what was going on.
Sounds like a lot of work and a lot of kind of combing through the paper documents and also approaching the right people to get them to talk. And also another question was that you were a reporter, but then the book is sort of a long, story. And I think from the writing styles perspective, did you have to adapt from, reporting style to a novel style? And how was that a, natural adaptation, or you just had to follow whatever the fact was and just lay it out?
It was a balance between telling the definitive story of the fraud, because there are people who will read this book because they want to know what happened and want to know, what's the money trail? And then there are people who want to read it because they want to read a novel like nonfiction, right? A narrative nonfiction. And so we had to please two camps. So you're always going to get some people who say, well, there's not enough money trail, and you're going to get people who say, well, there's too much money trail, depending on what they're looking for. But I think, I don't know, maybe if we did it again, we'd take out a bit of the money trail because you don't need to know all of the ins and outs of it. We started at the Journal of trying to not get sued and prove the money. And so there's a lot of caveats, a lot of allegedlys, a lot of sourcing line by line. We had that hanging over us still with the book, so that somehow hamstrung us in terms of readability. But I think we did a pretty good job. And one thing we tried to do was to have scenes in every. We did lots of short chapters, so there's like 50 chapters, and scenes at the beginning of every chapter that really draw you into the world. So whether that's Playboy Playmates and Leonardo DiCaprio, or Busta Rhymes in a recording studio with Jolo calling him his bitch. Those are the kinds of scenes that it sort of sugars the pill of all of the difficult material that you need to get across, right? But at the same time, we still wanted the people who finished the book to say, okay, now I understand how the world really works. So Bradley and I have a company called Project Brazen, and a lot of things we do are, how does the world really work? We have a great podcast coming out about a European royal family that shows how royal families really work and the sordid nature of those institutions. We have Fat Leonard, our hit podcast from last year, which is about how does military corruption work, and how does what was the post-September the 11th world like? So we try to sort of get that stuff across, but do it in an entertaining way. So that's the key to it all.
I certainly felt like it achieved both purposes. I learned a lot of facts from the book, but I also really enjoyed sort of listening to the story itself and how it developed, and it was very vivid the way you wrote it. So I think it was definitely one of the most interesting books that I've ever read. Next question, I think, is probably going to be pretty short. What do you think are the top quality one should possess to be an investigative journalist?
Well, anyway, thanks for saying that about the book. It's not always nice to hear something like that. Tenacity is a really important one. I mean, I actually ended up leaving the journal at the end of all of this because I was just so burnt out. It was so exhausting to do this. I mean, imagine an Excel spreadsheet of all of your BlackBerry conversations from 2010 to 2015. There's a lot of nonsense in there, right? And I had to go through it line by line. And Jolo's talking about getting, mee bihun noodles at the local store, and then his grandfather passes away, and there's just a lot of stuff that wasn't that relevant. And then, you get to the line that says, ping, and he's pinging his banker on BlackBerry saying, hey, Najib's credit cards aren't working at the Chanel store. He's in a Chanel store in Hawaii. And then you go, oh, I've seen a credit card statement for him in a Chanel store in Hawaii, and it was for $130,000 US. Right? So you've got a credit card statement for $130,000 US. Najib's credit card, someone leaked them to us. You've got a BlackBerry message, Jolo, saying Najib's in the store and his credit card isn't working, and trying to get the banker to sort it out. Then you've got, that's when Najib was playing golf with President Obama. So then I flew to Hawaii and went to 2 Chanel stores and tried to find out what had happened. And in one of them, a saleswoman was willing to talk to me, and I waited for 6 hours for her to finish her shift in a nearby Starbucks. And then, so you have to get all those different elements together to paint the picture. And that's, if you go in the book, that's the chapter where Rosma, Najib's wife, is angry because he has to fly back from Hawaii, where they've gone on a state visit because there's been flooding in Malaysia. And so to assuage her, it's her birthday, and he buys her a $130,000 Chanel watch in that store at that time, and his credit card doesn't work. And this is one of the transactions that he's gone to jail for, because this was all funded with Malaysian state money. So it'll become it's almost like, the Imelda Marcos 1,000 pair of shoes, right? But you need to be tenacious, because you need to do all of those things, including going through the BlackBerry messages, sitting outside the Starbucks for 6 hours, going into the first Chanel I got thrown out of on Waikiki Beach because, they don't want to talk to some random person coming in. You need to be the kind of person who can walk into any room and just not care if you're not supposed to be there. That's not an easy. When you first start in journalism, you don't feel like that. You pick up the phone, you feel scared, but you end up becoming very sort of rhino-skinned about all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I'd say that those are the key things.
That I think you guys had a lot of information at hand already, so perhaps it's just you have to be patient to comb them through and just fill the gaps and interview people. Was there any point when you were writing other stories that you just felt like this just seems like a dead end? I need the next piece of information to come together. I just can't find it, or the people won't want to talk to me. I'm halfway through and it's not looking good, then what do I do? Was there ever a moment like that?
Yeah, well, we structured the book out with chapters, and there was big holes of knowledge about certain characters, right? I mean, at one point, it was very difficult to get anything about Jolo's early life. Obviously, Jolo himself didn't cooperate with this book. And so you had this, I think one problem all nonfiction books have is how do you invest in a reader how do you hook them? They're going to have to read 300, 400 pages. How do you hook them? So, we have that epilogue of Jolo and this probably the most expensive private party ever held in Vegas for his birthday. And then we had to go back into his early life, and it was like pulling teeth trying to get people to talk because, Penang, where he's from, it's quite a clannish place. People are not going to start talking about knowing Jolo and his family and all the dirty secrets of the grandfather and all this. And it was just difficult, but we managed to find people who knew the father, and turns out the father was a fraudster, and the father had also flown Swedish models out to the boat in the 80s and 90s when Jolo was growing up. That was very difficult. And then, like I said, we got these computer servers of a number of different people, and those were treasure troves of information. The Petra Saudi one that The Edge and the Sarawak report got, and then we got a copy of that. The film companies, emails, all those kinds of things. Like, for example, we knew that Jolo was friends with Leonardo DiCaprio, right? But we didn't have a scene. So it was going to be you can't just say, look, he knew Leonardo DiCaprio. You had to have Leonardo DiCaprio doing something in the book. That was a big problem, and that was very early on. Then we got hold of the computer service for Red Granite, and it had all the phone contacts of the Playboy Playmates that they used to hire to go to parties. So I cold called all these Playboy Playmates, and one of them said, yeah, I remember going to a party with DiCaprio. So we're able to get information about this weird party which DiCaprio attends with Jolo and 20 plus Playmates. So there were many of those kinds of moments where you didn't have scenes and you had to create scenes, but we always broke through with the reporting to be able to do it.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'm definitely anxious to wait for the Hunting the Whale, if that would ever come out.
Well, I don't know whether that's the official title. I don't know.
Let's just call it that for now.
Well, we have a newsletter called Whale Hunting, which everyone should subscribe to, where we break news. I mean, we actually broke the news on there before anyone else in the world that Jared Kushner had taken $2 billion from the Saudis. And the New York Times had to cite us on their front page, but they didn't know how to cite us because we're like, I think they said according to the website Project Brazen, which is the name of our company. So,
right.
So subscribe to that. It's where we will drop a lot of our reporting and things that we're hearing and projects we're working on, all that kind of stuff. That's
great. So audience, if you would like to know any of the follow-ups of the Jolo story, please go and subscribe to Hunting Whale. Well, thank you very much for talking about the book, Tom. I think we have limited time, so I wanted to just ask you one last question, and that relates back to, I guess, what Openspace does. We are an early stage technology investing firm in Southeast Asia, and a lot of the companies we invest are in emerging countries, right, in this part of the world, and we do have to do our own diligence as well before investing, so we avoid any unpleasant surprises after we invest, because a lot of things could look quite murky from the surface, from emerging market governance. So what advice would you give to us to do a good job in diligence phase so we can do better and also avoid unpleasant surprises after investing?
I think it comes down to personal ethics and a sense of empowerment. So one thing I noticed, if you look at the transcripts that the Department of Justice in the US put out, where Jolo's people are trying to push through a big multi-billion-dollar, hundreds of millions of dollars corrupt payment through Deutsche Bank, I think it was. The banker, she's got questions. She's like, why is a sovereign wealth fund in Malaysia moving hundreds of millions into a Seychelles, bearer share company? But she's steamrolled. You have to make your people feel empowered to say, hey, that smells bad. It is bad, and I'm escalating it. When people are actually under pressure, compliance people are under pressure to push through deals because of the bottom line rather than to stop corruption. That's where all the problems are happening, and they're happening over and over again. Auditors push through dodgy accounts because they want the account and they're under pressure to make that money. Lawyers push through all kinds of nonsense because they hide behind lawyer-client privilege. And compliance people, this story isn't really about private equity like yourselves, but I think the same ethos can apply. You have to have strong personal ethics, and you have to be empowered to say, even if you're junior, to say, no, this is wrong, and I'm escalating this.
Right. Do you also have to have an intuitive sense of skepticism going into a lot of these things?
Everyone should be skeptical.
Yeah.
But not so skeptical you become cynical like me. Well, journalists are very good at criticizing things, right? And people who actually do, they have to operate in the real world, and there's always going to be corruption and some compromises, but you just have to have your strong ethics.
Well said. Well, thank you very much, Tom, for coming on to the Craft series. We learned a lot about the book, behind the scene, and different techniques for investigative journalism and how that can even be applied to our day-to-day work in early stage investment. We are very excited to stay tuned on what's coming up on Hunting the Whale and hope to eventually see the book be turned into a movie. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.